All right, welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and this is episode 26. Today we are joined by Dr. Adrián Muñoz, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Asian and African Studies at el Colegio de México. Adrián, welcome to the Yogic Studies podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. It's a nice midday here in Mexico City. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy and excited about this whole experience.
Yes, it's been a long time coming. I think we've been talking about this, I feel like, for a long time. And it's really a joy to work with you, to have you on for the podcast here today, but of course to have you at Yogic Studies teaching this online course, Latin or Yoga in Latin America, YS 118, which of course we will have plenty of time to get to. As we were prepping for today's course, as we were prepping for today's podcast, I was thinking back to when we first met, and I was trying to remember, I had been familiar with your work for quite a while as a grad student, looking at the history of hatha yoga, and I knew of your work on the Nāth yogis. And I think at one point, maybe we were like giving feedback on a paper on academia.edu.
Oh, yes, that's right.
I think maybe our friend, colleague Keith Cantu had put up a paper asking for feedback, and we were both giving like live comments on it. And I don't know.
Yeah, true. That's right.
We were really thinking along the same lines about some of the comments, and to me, it was reaffirming. I was like, oh, okay, if Adrián thinks this is right, then I must be on the right track here.
Yes, I had forgotten about that. Yes. Didn't it have to do something with serpents? That text by Keith? I forgot.
Yeah. It was
a long time ago.
It might have been a Bengali Baul text on yoga that was incorporating Nāth and hatha yoga elements. So I think there was something about serpents and chakras and, a unique subtle body system there. But that was, one early encounter. But then I think we met in person. I can't remember which conference or workshop was the first one, but we've had the opportunity to spend some time together at these workshops.
I think that the first one was at the South Asia conference in Madison, but I don't remember whether this was in 2015 or 2018.
Okay.
I have only been twice to this conference. So it was in one of them, and it was probably a friend of ours, a friend that we have in common, and a former classmate of mine in Mexico, Genoveva Castro, who probably introduced us, but I don't remember if she did it like in person or through an email.
Oh, yes. No, I remember that meeting now. And yes, Genoveva and we crossed paths at the University of Washington in Seattle.
Yeah.
I was doing my MA. And yes, she also went to the same university, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Did she study with you there, or were you?
Yes, we were classmates for during the master's degree. So we shared joys and griefs. Yes. It was a tough period of time, but enjoyable as well. Yeah. And she's a very dear friend.
Good. Yeah, and then we spent a good amount of time together at that Sanskrit yoga text reading workshop in Portland, Oregon, which was sponsored by the Hatha Yoga Project, which feels like a lifetime ago now, pre-COVID.
Incredible, yes.
But what an amazing experience that was, just getting to take a week of retreat at the ashram center in Oregon, and just getting to read with some of the world's best, right?
It was an incredible experience, yes. I feel very honored to have been invited. So I'm very thankful to James Lorenzen and Jason Birch, who invited me over. And I've met them before a couple of times in London, but I've never met Alexis Sanderson before. It was my very first time and it was such a treat. He's an amazing guy.
It's a rare treat to be able to read Sanskrit texts with him, sitting around a table like that, to have that kind of time and spaciousness, and to just kind of have an intellectual feast like that, and to just get to sort of receive that download and transmission from him.
It's out of this world. He's not only a very knowledgeable man in Sanskrit and tantric traditions, but he's also got a very fine sense of humor. He's
Absolutely.
very amusing.
Underrated sense of humor.
Completely, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of the great academics do.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah. And I think we also met 1 year before in London. Is that possible? Did you come to the, what was it called? It was another workshop. It was hosted in both SOAS and Open University.
Oh, no, I didn't go to that one. Maybe that was a celebration of one of the book projects that you guys did?
It was a preparation for it, yes.
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, I didn't participate in that particular one, but I know what you're referring to. Yeah. But a lot of different crossing of paths. I mean, we've been in touch, over the years as well. Our shared mutual interests and passion for the history of yoga, but the Naths and hatha yoga in particular. So how did you get into all of this, Adrian? I mean, tell me a little bit about your story, your background. I believe growing up in Mexico and discovering the study of India and yoga. But then tell us, how did that lead into yoga in particular and your work on the Nāth yogis?
It sounds like commonplace, but it is a long story. And many things have happened. Well, one of the things that we probably have to take into account is that in most of the countries of Latin America, we don't have academic degrees in South Asian studies or Asian studies in general. You have very few selected places or courses, but it's not general or spread. So if you're in Mexico and you want to do some undergraduate studies in some Asian culture, you would not find it. And that is true for other countries in Latin America, most of them, with an exception in Buenos Aires. But you don't have this. And that means that it's usually not a decision or a natural decision to study India or Japan or whatever. So you usually choose more standard topics, so to speak. And in my case, I went for literature, English literature in particular. And that was already weird in Mexico. It wasn't common, no? And I went to the National Autonomous University of Mexico, which is the largest one in Latin America, a very important one. And I actually was interested in poetry mainly. Well, still am. Although my first approaches to literature were through fiction, short stories and a couple of novels. But once I was studying at the university, I was enthralled by poetry.
And you've recently published the works of poetry, right?
That's right. Yeah, I published my second volume of poetry this year, and that's another story. And there are many things to it, but yes, I'm quite happy about it. There's a lot of it's got to do with who I am, as a matter of fact, and I had neglected that part for many years for scholar reasons, basically. Not only, but predominantly. Now, if you're studying English literature, I mean, the most natural choice if you eventually go to South Asian studies would be post-colonial literature. It happens quite often, but that wasn't my case. I don't know if it had to do with the fact that I was more interested in poetry, and most of the people doing post-colonial literature are working basically on prose and fiction, not poetry. Well, not that much, at least.
But why South Asia? What pulled you
Yeah,
to India?
Well, at some point during my BA, I started reading things on both Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. Of course, no scholarly things on the topics, like very general things for the general audience. But both appealed to me quite a lot. And eventually, when I had to write my BA dissertation, I chose to write on William Blake, which is still one of my favorite authors. And I tried to do this very crazy thing of sort of comparative reading, trying to understand William Blake's poetics through the eyes of Advaita Vedanta and Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. It's a completely crazy thing. But that's probably how I got into it. I think that it was my first immersion into Indian philosophy and partially Indian religions. But by that time, I still wanted to do a career in English literature. And basically, I wanted to become a literary translator. And then I took this training course. It was a 2-year training course in el Colegio de México to become a more professional translator of English to Spanish. The thing is that we had like different courses, obviously linguistics and language and so forth, and translation workshops. But then we had also one course per semester devoted to Asian traditions, or rather Asian cultures. And we had a semester for the Arab world, another one for China, another one for Japan, and another one for India. And I was just in love completely. And then I learned about the Center for Asian and African Studies and the fact that I would be expected to learn an Indian language. So I was doubly interested, and I completely changed then my orientation. I decided to go for the master's degree in el Colegio de México, not anymore pursuing a career in English literature. But in a sense, I guess my translation motifs are still there to some degree, no?
So you had aspirations to go on to grad school to become an academic already when you were doing your undergraduate work?
I don't know if that was that clear. What I had very clear in my mind is that I wanted to work with text, and preferably by doing some translations. I wasn't that sure that I would become a scholar, not as an undergrad, probably not even as a master's degree student. If I eventually had any notion of this, it would be like very far-fetched, like something that would never happen to me, completely unachievable. That was for other people, geniuses, or I don't know what. But evidently life changed.
And so you ended up doing your MA in Mexico City. And who was running that program? Who were you studying with at that time? And how did your MA experience lay the foundation then for something life-changing that then, really did shape a career for you?
Well, of course, this was completely eye-opening because I had no previous experience of studying or properly studying in-depth things that were related to Indian history and culture and languages. I knew that there were one or two classes in my former university, UNAM, but they were like not mandatory courses in any department. They were just optional, especially in the philosophy department. But I didn't take that course anyway, so I had no previous experience except for my informal readings of Advaita Vedanta. And then El Colegio de México is in size, it is a small institution. It has a very high reputation, but we are a small institution. So we have a very small number of both staff and students. And El Colegio de México is itself divided in different departments or centers. So in my center, we are probably 25 instructors. It's not that much if you take into account that we are divided into 6 areas of specialization. So it's even a smaller number, the staff for South Asian studies. And there was David Lorenzen, of course, who eventually became my mentor. Benjamin Preciado, a Mexican scholar, recently retired. He was my advisor during my master's degree. Then I had Professor Rasik Vihari Joshi, Vaishnava Pandit from Maharashtra. He was my Sanskrit teacher, the 2 years, and an extra year in my PhD. Uma Tukral, who was a Hindi teacher. Well, she's still the Hindi teacher, but I didn't take Hindi in my master's degree. And then these other 2 Indian colleagues, Saurabh Dubey and Nishita Banerjee, who basically do subaltern studies and modern history. I had courses with most of them except for Uma because I wasn't studying Hindi. And the structure of this degree is extremely formative because of the lack of a previous degree. So the intention of the master's degree program here in Colegio de México is meant to provide whatever we were lacking. So every single aspect of history, from the Indus Valley civilization up to contemporary India, and a whole range of different courses on society, culture, religions, and so forth and so forth. And then, of course, each semester we had to take courses on language, in my case, Sanskrit, apart from the mandatory courses on history. And then eventually for my thesis, I wrote on Sarasvati. So I didn't write on poetry or Sanskrit poetry at all. I rather chose a mythological topic. But well, I guess in a sense, there was still some attachment to poetry because she is the goddess of learning and poetry and wisdom. Mm-hmm. So I guess it was still there. And what I did was a humble monograph on how the figure of Sarasvati stayed and was consolidated from the Vedic period onto the Puranic one, and then a couple of reflections on some of the manifestations that she has in tantric traditions. I've forgotten many of the things, of course, because I wrote this a long time ago. It was an interesting topic. I'd like to get back to it, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, sounds like it. So you're doing your grad training. You're studying Hindu mythology, Saraswati, vast history, method and theory. You're getting your Sanskrit language training. Eventually, I think in the PhD you start learning Hindi as well. Is that right? Where does yoga come in for you?
It wasn't obvious, actually. And this is, I don't know, funny, but I mean, it's worth mentioning. Most of the scholars right now working on yoga have a direct experience practicing yoga or some form of yoga, and that was not my case. Whenever I happened to eventually practice some form of yoga was much later, and I had already begun studying South Asian history and Sanskrit, so it was the other way around. It wasn't yoga that took me to South Asian studies. It was South Asian studies that eventually led me to yoga. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes makes me feel a bit funny when I'm with my colleagues who I know are much more like immersed in yoga practice. No, it's, well, I mean, it's just odd, no?
I think, well, I know what you're saying, but I think these days there's quite a range of backgrounds of people coming to yoga studies. I feel like in some ways yoga is like a up and coming, it's a hot topic or subject within the broader South Asian studies. So people, sometimes want to jump on or are interested in exploring that, but have different training, different backgrounds. So I know what you mean, but there's a diversity, right, among yoga scholars. But I like the way you're saying that. It is true. I mean, for me, I think, as you know, it was yoga that led me to India and South Asia, and South Asian studies. Whereas for you, it's the reverse. South Asian studies that leads you to yoga. I imagine, studying with David Lorenzen, you were getting exposed to Shaivism and Tantra, and perhaps is that where maybe the Nāth yogis kind of came onto your radar, is maybe through some of those courses and conversations? Or how did the Nāth yogis kind of become a central focus of your research?
When of course, after my MA, the natural choice was to pursue a PhD, and originally I had thought of probably looking for some institution in the UK, SOAS or other place. I wasn't completely sure. But there was this difficult situation back home. My father was in a very terrible medical condition because of an arrest, a terrible arrest that completely destroyed his brain. And I decided to stay in Mexico, so to share the burden with my brother and my mother. He had to take care of my dad. He was almost 4 years in a semi-vegetative state. It was a horrible thing, a complete nightmare. But then I decided to stay in Mexico. El Colegio de México had a PhD program. We do not right now because of different reasons. We are trying to redesign the program, but right now we don't have it. There was, and of course, I already knew David Lorenzen. So because of my work on Sarasvati, I became interested in the tantric culture. I was like very much drawn to it. So originally I had envisioned a work on tantric imagery. It was very, very vague. Tantric imagery, specifically in Kaula literature. And so that's what I proposed. And of course, because David Lorenzen had already done work on Shaivism and early tantric forms of religion, he was chosen as my advisor. And I continued with Sanskrit. At the time, if you were at the PhD program at the Colegio de México, well, at the Center for Asian and African Studies, you had to choose a second language. And that's why I chose Hindi, which was fortunate because I didn't know that it would eventually be quite beneficial for me.
That's often how it goes, right? You have to choose language, and at the time, you don't really know what you want to do.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky, it'll be the right one, and that's the material and literature and traditions you want to work on. But it's oftentimes only at later stages of your dissertation research when you say, "Oh, I should have learned Kannada or Telugu."
Exactly.
Oh, man.
Exactly.
So good. Okay. Fortuitous.
But then the thing is that because I became interested in tantric literature, Kaula literature in particular, somehow I came across Nath. And because of Nath, which is a major figure in some Kaula traditions, I came to know this order of yogis whom I knew nothing about before, the Nath yogis, and I was like completely, oh no, it was very, very interesting because of a whole range of different reasons.
So on the one hand, Matiendra led you to the Naths.
Matiendra led me to the Naths, and that's there is another Matiendra Nath later on in my life, actually, but I'll come to it if I don't forget. Well, not directly in my life, but somehow. I began reading on the Naths, and of course, the Naths were around by the time of Kabir. And David Lorenzen was also a very important scholar on Kabir. So he was doubly interested in advising me. It was like mutual, I guess. And it was very fortunate for me to have David Lorenzen as my advisor, because he had like this background in tantric studies, but also in Bhakti literature. It was great. No, I had no idea. I was coming across this huge universe of the Naths. So, I began reading on them, and they were not quite tantric, but there was a lot of tantric ideas and notions in their text. They had a lot to do with yoga.
For our listeners, give us a word or two or sentence or two. Who are the Naths that we're talking about?
Well, to put it simply, we can explain the Nath yogis as a group, a religious group or order of basically renouncers, although there are a couple of exceptions. A group of renouncers who have been traditionally linked to the practice of hatha yoga. And we are unsure, but they have probably been in existence since the 13th or 14th century. There are a lot of controversies around, of course, and I mean the recent scholarship has been pushing the dates constantly back and forth, especially because we are unsure whether the actual name Nath Panth or Nath Sampradaya was used in former times, or whether this is a modern usage. But despite that, even if they didn't use the name, a grouping of wandering ascetics which were linked to this particular form of yoga, hatha yoga, were probably very likely present and very strongly in North India, especially North India, since the 13th or 14th century. We know this because there are a lot of allusions to them in the poetry by Kabir and Guru Nanak. There is a constant competence with them. And that means that these yogis were extremely influential and important at the time.
And South India.
I beg your pardon?
And South India. We now know.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. I knew you were coming. Yes, of course. You're right. Yes, of course.
But yes, go on. Yeah, because these writings of these bhaktas there's this
exactly.
language.
And the other thing that was quite interesting for me is that unlike other groups, religious groups, they had literature in Sanskrit and in the vernaculars, which is not common. Usually you have either in Sanskrit or in some form of vernaculars, especially if they're bhaktas, and people like Kabir or Surdas, they would strictly use vernaculars because this is a political stance or socio-political stance. And on the other hand, usually you would find completely Sanskritic forms. There are different reasons, but this is usually how it goes. And this was not the case. And I find this fascinating. And then, of course, eventually I get to know about this collection of mystical poetry, very much like the Bhakta Sant poetry related to the Naths. And there is this famous collection known as the Gorakbani. I haven't done a lot of work on it. It's a very difficult corpus. Other people have, but not much, actually. There are like 2 or 3 people. Mm-hmm. And, well, currently, at least, Gordon Durjevich mm-hmm. and Christine Marewa-Karowski, both of them are working on this material. They're probably very competent on it. But before them, I think there was just one Indian scholar, Bartwal, and that's it. Mm. And then, okay, I was first interested in tantric imagery. Then I got into Kaula, and then Matsyendranath, and then the Nath yogis. Oh, there is a complete fascinating history of hatha yoga. And then on reading the texts of hatha yoga, which were ascribed to the Nath yogis, of course, we aren't sure if they were really Nath documents, but at least traditional says so, or had been saying so. You read the text and then you try to remember what sort of common images you can evoke about the contemporary practices of hatha yoga. And it's like, there is not much in common, or yes, there is something in common, but there are probably more differences than similarities between the text in Sanskrit and what is actually happening in the studios. What's happening here? No, so I guess this is one of the first motivations for me to begin studying history and literature of yoga. We first had a yoga, but then now it's much more broader. Now, for the PhD, I had to spend 1 year in India. Mm-hmm. And this is a completely crazy story, because even if though I had to go to India formally, there were no formal funds for this. So I had to make do with whatever I had. No. Mm. And well, eventually what I did was just paid for a one-way ticket. I couldn't afford the round trip because I was traveling with my former wife. So we could only afford one round ticket, hers, not mine. It's a crazy thing. And I applied for a scholarship to the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. And what I presented was a monograph on tantric imagery in Kaula literature. And I kept waiting for the answer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, nothing at all. Mm-hmm. I just went with what I had. Of course, I sold my car and I don't know what else. So we went and we spent about a year. Mm-hmm. Everywhere. Well, basically in North India. The farthest point in South that we went to, which is basically in central India, is Mumbai, and that's it. We didn't have the chance. Of course, India is so large that you cannot do it. I mean, even in a year, it's just not possible. No? And we spent a lot of months both in Delhi and in Varanasi, plus 1 month in Kathmandu, in Nepal. I basically devoted time to look and find whatever books I could, and pamphlets and popular books on the Naths, and of course on Kaula literature. This strengthened my relationship to the Nath Sampradaya. Of course, I also went to Gorakhpur mm-hmm. and got a lot of books from their bookstore, not only theirs, but outside as well, and in different pilgrimage sites.
I know most of the work that you do is textual, but in your time in India and interacting with those field sites, temple sites like Gorakhpur, Did you have an opportunity to interact with the living Nāth yogis and Sampradaya? And did that impact your work or your understanding?
Yes, as a matter of fact, yes. When I was there and reading through the scholarly literature, well, the assumption was that even the inventors of hatha yoga were the Nath yogis. So, of course, when I went to Gorakhpur, I stayed there probably 3 nights in the temple. I got an interview and they allowed me to stay with the sadhus. And well, I'm at Gorakhpur, at the Nath yogis' main mandir. So why not do yoga? No, they have a yoga stala, of course. So I got early at 5 a.m. in the morning and then went to this yoga stala, and there was no yogi or no sadhu there, just people from town. And even the instructor was somebody from town. He was not initiated. He was no yogi or sadhu or whatever. It's like, what? No, I didn't expect this. And then, of course, I tried to look more carefully and even ask a couple of questions to some of the sadhus there. And I never saw anybody practicing like physical yoga or like in meditation. No? That does not mean that there are no Nath yogis doing that, but not in Gorakhpur, at least.
And not publicly.
Probably not publicly, but I, even though I had a very poor Hindi, I managed to have this interview with Mahant, with Nath. He was very, very old, of course, and he couldn't stay for a long time. It was a brief interview. And I had the assistance of another sadhu staying there, a Hare Krishna, as it turns out, who was on the process of becoming a Nath yogi. He was waiting for his first step of the initiation rituals. He had no earlobe perforated yet. And I asked him about a couple of practices that were in the Hathayoga Pradipika, a couple of things concerning the Kaula Nyaya Nirnaya, which is a tantric text attributed to Matsyendranath. And it was very striking. He was very, very clear. We are no Vamacharins, we are Dakshinacharins. So it was a clear rejection of any possible tantric associations. They wanted nothing to do with Tantra. And of course, Gorakhpur is now much more close to, say, orthodoxy, Hindu orthodoxy, and the Hindu rite. And of course, Tantra is far from acceptable. This is something that usually outside of India we are not aware of. We tend to romanticize Tantra, but as a matter of fact, in India, usually Tantra means black magic, superstition, and it's cheap and it's bad. It's not respectable unless you're a scholar. But otherwise, exactly. And I've heard this more than once, not just from Nath, from other yogis as well. Nath yogis, I mean. I also remember that when walking in the Gorakhpur Mandir, this is a huge place, of course. It's not just a temple. It's a complex, a huge complex with yards and the library and halls and different sorts of offices. And in one of them, I could see a young, recently initiated Nath yogi who was being prepared to, manage different administrative activities, not just of the temple internally, but in Gorakhpur, politically. Mm-hmm. Well, he was Aditya Nath. It was quite striking. Yeah, no, it was. I didn't speak to him, but had I known, I probably would have managed some sort of interview.
So around what year would this have been?
That was 2004 or 2005.
Okay. And for listeners who might not know, who is Yogi Adityanath? Who is
Well,
he today in India?
he is a political figure. He is the head, the Mahant of Gorakhpur Mandir. So officially, he's at the head of the Nath Sampradaya. Of course, that can be a little bit problematic, but at least
Officially.
officially. Yeah. But he's also a politician. And this is also very interesting and something that we take for granted. In other parts of the world, usually you see with suspicion, and you usually don't accept that religious figures take part in political matters. We don't like this. We usually try to separate. In the Mexican Constitution, this is very clear. There is a clear distinction and separation. You don't want one meddling in the other. Of course, it happens all the time, but officially it doesn't. And in India, it's not like this. Religious figures can be politicians, formal politicians. And he's a member of the parliament, and he's part of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a right-wing party, usually in opposition to the Congress party. And he belongs into a lineage of Mahants of Gorakhpur who have been MPs themselves. Now, Adityanath is also what's the official name of this? The chief, oh God, I forgot the official name for it.
Chief Minister or something?
The Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah.
A huge state. Yeah. So he's very powerful. But he's also very...
Just to clarify, he's a yogi initiated into this medieval lineage of the Nāth yogis, closely associated with the development of hathayoga. He's the Mahant today of the Gorakhpur temple, and he is this chief minister, this very powerful politician of the northern state of Uttar Pradesh. So this very powerful commingling of yoga, religion, and politics, and a particular brand of politics.
Absolutely. He's a close ally to Narendra Modi, India's prime minister.
Yeah. Yeah, we could continue. I mean, we could have a whole talk about yoga and politics and the role that he and the Nāth yogis then play. I mean, it's really important, and I think I know you're working on a book project, right, on this subject, or you're involved in an edited volume.
Oh yes, well, I have like two things coming.
Okay.
One is on the Nāth yogis and power and politics. That's an edited volume by Daniela Bevilacqua and Eloisa Stuparic. I hope it's bound to be published soon. Okay. I have to ask. So if she gets to listen to this podcast.
Daniela, where's the book at? No,
where's the book? And
I know she's got a lot of books she's working on right now. So no pressure, Daniela G.
Well, that's part of, being part of the Hatha Yoga project, I guess, no? But never mind. I'm going to skip a little. To get back to one interesting thing that had to do with this rejection of Tantra. The thing is that when I received a response from the ICCR, that, okay, we are going to give you a scholarship, was like 4 days before I was coming back to Mexico.
So almost a year later.
Almost a year later. And of course, I didn't use it. There was it was just senseless.
Wow.
But the interesting thing is that I somehow learned eventually that the reason that they did not grant me the scholarship was because of the topic.
I was wondering.
That's why
Tantrism is, Yeah,
that's why.
Had you done something on just more, modern postural yoga or Patanjali or Vedanta or something that, is a little bit more orthodox frankly.
Yeah. Well, and that, probably because I'm now doing like work on more recent forms of yoga and like nothing, or at least not directly related to Tantra. I have been invited by the ICCR now, but through the Indian embassy in Mexico to different events. A couple of them in Mexico.
Was it an International Day of Yoga celebration or something like that in India? I remember seeing on social media there was some event you were invited as like a delegate of Mexico to come to India for something.
That one was for the Kumbh Mela in 2019.
Oh, okay.
It was an invitation from the part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the ICCR. And they had like this campaign. The idea was to invite delegates or ambassadors, as they call it, or call them, from about 200 countries to attend the Kumbh Mela. And of course, when they invited me, and I mean, they would pay for the airplane ticket and accommodation. I mean, of course, I want to go. It's not like I can do this every year.
That sounds like a big group.
It was a huge group. Of course, I didn't get to speak to everybody. It was just impossible. But also because of the schedule, when I received the schedule by email, the idea was something like this. I would fly on February the 21st and then back to Mexico on the 24th. That is spending just 2 days in India, because flying from Mexico to India, I mean, it takes almost a day. It's about 24 hours. And with the stopovers and the jet lag, I mean, 2 days is just crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Especially to go to an event like the Kumbh Mela, just the largest gathering of human beings on the planet.
But then, of course, when we were there, we were lodged in Allahabad. Well, it was already called Prayagraj. They've changed the name, as well, some people know, because of political reasons. We're not going into that again. But we were lodged in Prayagraj, but in Delhi, actually just by the airport. What is it called? The Earth City, I think, just by the Indira Gandhi airport. And then one day we had to listen to these talks by both the minister herself and by the prime minister himself. Modi eventually came to us after 3 hours. We were waiting for a long time. And then the other day we were taken to the Kumbh Mela, but it was already finished. I mean, there was no crowd. We could barely see any sadhus. They had already left. Because the great period of the specific days for the deepens in river from the sadhus had already taken place. And even the locals or the pilgrims weren't there anymore. It was like, why? Well, I can guess, so they can have more control on us and to prevent potential accidents. I don't know.
Sure.
But then I managed to extend my stay in India. I mean, I've already.
And what did Modi say to you? To your
you know that this was a gesture of friendship from India.
Did he speak in English or Hindi with a translator?
Just a little bit in English, but most of it was in Hindi with a translator, or different translators, I guess. There were probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 languages. Spanish, English, French, Italian, Arabic. There were people from all over the world, from Saudi Arabia and Morocco, even Pakistan. You wouldn't expect that, but yes, there was somebody from Pakistan and Cote d'Ivoire, and of course other countries in Latin America.
What was the purpose of that trip from the Indian government side? Was it in some ways to showcase, to highlight Indian culture and to create?
Yes, definitely it was, and I think this is part of what's also behind the campaign for what was a campaign for the acceptance for the International Day of Yoga. Of course, this is a political campaign, and yoga is being heralded as a cultural item, which is very useful for political purposes. It's part of India's soft power, along with performing arts and Bollywood. So this was part of it. Well, their, let's say, cultural policy to, make a point as to their importance in foreign international affairs. And I think that most of the people or the delegates, the ambassadors, were they agree with this. No? I exchanged a couple of comments with some of them, and none of them were scholars. I mean, if there was any scholar, I didn't get the chance to speak to him or her. But the people I talked to, most of them were journalists, tourist guides, instructors of yoga, of course, people interested in all sorts of cultural topics, or alternative therapies. But I didn't really meet any scholar that I remember right now. And if I did, and I'm forgetting, I apologize.
So Adrian, back to the Nāth yogis and sort of to your story of coming up through academia and grad school. You ended up falling into this research on the Nāth yogis, produced a dissertation. Eventually, with your advisor, you guys co-published and edited this book, Yogi Heroes and Poets, which I'm now realizing, okay, kind of returned you to your roots of English literature, poetry, your love for poetry. You kind of found that in some ways in the Nāth themselves. Tell me a little bit about this book, but then I also want to lead this into a question about publications. This is something we were talking a little bit about before. This book, thankfully for me, is published in English and was informative for me in my grad studies. A wonderful collection of academic essays from a variety of scholars working on the Nāth yogis and householder Naths as well, published in English, and then some of your other important work that you've gone on to do, and I imagine your dissertation itself, published in Spanish. So tell us a little bit about this book project, but then maybe we can have a conversation about the kind of perils and challenges of working as an academic in Spanish and English, deciding when to publish in Spanish, when to publish in English.
Right. Okay, so the story behind the book is actually very close or intertwined with my own PhD process. Well, actually, the thesis. I don't remember how exactly, but David Lorenzen managed to have Daniel Gold read my thesis. And then David decided to organize this very small conference in Mexico City. And apart from, obviously, some colleagues who were del Colegio de México, David, myself, and Ishita Banerjee, he had the participation and the attendance of the two Golds, both Anne and Daniel. June McDaniel was here, and Aditya Bell also was here some years before he passed away, unfortunately. And Lubomir Ondrachka. That's when I met him.
Okay.
He came to Mexico City all the way from the Czech Republic. And I think that's it. It was just us. But this was fantastic because the conference coincided with my oral defense, so that Daniel could be the defense, of course. But it was a treat. It was almost like a gift. He didn't say so. I mean, speaking on the part of David, but I think it was a sort of gift. Somehow I'd like to think like that. I collaborated to the renewal of his interest in yoga and tantra, so much that he decided to host this conference. And then having these people come over, especially the Gauls, whom I kept citing all throughout my thesis. It was incredible. I've never met them before. One of the things of being a scholar in such a discipline as South Asian studies in Mexico is that you don't have the chance to share spaces with the other scholars. Most of them are in the US or the UK, and then some others in the rest of Europe. But you don't have the chance. We are not constantly attending this conference, and they are not coming to Mexico unless such a thing like this that David organized happened. So it was really formidable, no? To really get to know these great minds and discuss with them. And because of that conference, David proposed the idea of editing this volume. Of course, we invited some other people. Aditya Bell couldn't make it, but we had the chance to incorporate other pieces like Shabakis, which is a very philological sort of work. And what else is there?
I think David Gordon White has a.
Oh yes, of course, David Gordon White. Yeah, of course. And he, if I don't remember incorrectly, he gave us a partial advance of something that was going to be eventually published or had to do to some other publication. I don't remember if it was something that was going to be addressed in his Sinister Yogis book. Probably. But yes, that's also great to have the opportunity of having this collaboration by David White. He couldn't make it to the conference. He was invited, of course, but I don't know, for whatever reason, he wasn't able to. And well, this publication was a huge thing for me, of course. My own chapter derives from things that I've done in my dissertation, and my dissertation eventually became a book. My first book, of course, it's in Spanish. And
which book is that?
It's called La piel de tigre y la serpiente. That's the tiger skin and the serpent. What's the subtitle? Nāth identity through hagiography or something like this. I quite forgot. Okay. But it's very much what I do in that chapter on a larger scale, of course, and dealing with a wider corpus of tales. And then this is related to your other question, because well, it is natural that your dissertation, your PhD dissertation, would become a book, at least partially a book. It's more or less what you would expect in an academic career.
Inshallah.
No, inshallah. No, we're still waiting for yours.
Dead silence.
And then, of course, in order for you to eventually win a position, you need these things. Yeah. But then that's a somewhat specialized book. And in that case, the Spanish readership, so how shall I put this? The thing is that in that dissertation, in that book, I am actually having conversations with the scholars that I read all during my training. Mm-hmm. That is basically an Anglophone training. So it's a bit weird because it's a dialogue with Anglophone scholars in a book written in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit bipolar, so to speak. I think it would have been much more inadequately read if I had published this in English. But then, of course, at some point I decided or thought maybe I should translate this, but
well,
just became impossible.
That's a really interesting point and observation you make. So, I mean, when you were working on that, and also even let's extend that even to today, are there other Mexican or just Latin American based scholars working on these subjects whose writings that you were engaging with or are? Perhaps it's changed somewhat the landscape since when you were doing your PhD to today. But maybe comment on that a little bit. It sounds you've already said the majority of the secondary scholarship that you were reading was in English, and you had limited contact because of your base in Colegio de México to travel to conferences and things like that, normal opportunities that a young scholar would like to try to have to network and things like that. What just talk about a little bit. Now I'm getting sidetracked because I want to talk about the Spanish English translations, but couched in that is part of this overall network of what it's like to do South Asian studies, in Latin America and in Mexico in particular.
Yeah, it's difficult, or it can be difficult. Well, you have two sides of it, of course. Since we are a very few number of scholars doing this, you can get closer to the embassy, and that's where I get invited to from the part of the ICCR to this and that. No, of course, if there were hundreds of scholars, it would be much more difficult. But on the other hand, you have fewer people to talk to on a daily basis, no? Because evidently my colleagues in el Colegio de México, they do different things. They're not all working on yoga or Sanskrit. They do different things. Contemporary India or Japanese art or whatever.
Sure. So, I mean, same thing at Harvard, I would say, actually. There was not a lot of other people working on hatha yoga at Harvard.
Yes, it's becoming trendy. Yes, it's becoming trendy. And that does not mean that there are no people in Latin America doing Indian or South Asian studies. There are. But of course, the lack of strongly vised departments makes it a little bit difficult to like collectively have a strong and solid network. Now we do have this association, a Latin American Association for South Asian and African Studies, which holds a conference an international one every forgot it's every 2 years, and then every year in between it's just a national or different national conferences, and then in these places we get to meet, and that's how I met a couple of my colleagues, especially Gabriel Martino, for example, who is my co-author for the Historia minima del yoga. He's a philosopher, and he's a Sanskritist as well. So he's in particular interested in Sanskrit and yoga philosophy. And we met probably in 2 or 3 of these conferences. And by the time I had already begun to think of trying to make a contribution to the field of modern yoga studies. So it's Hindu mythology, to Sarasvati, to Tantra, to Matsyendra Nath, to the Nath yogis, to hatha yoga, then to yoga in a broader sense, and then to now modern yoga. It's a very long line, no?
Modern yoga in Latin America, which we will get to. We will get to. So let me ask you. I think it's an obvious problem that we have in yoga studies, in South Asian studies. I would say, many of the humanities in general, beyond even just our specialized fields. But so much of the discourse is produced in the United States, in Europe, is Anglophone, is written in the English language. On the one hand, that makes it in some regards more accessible across different locales, regionalities, and so forth. But on the other hand, is limiting and has all kinds of problems and biases, and so much of the discourse is being shaped by Euro and Euro-American frameworks.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we need to encourage more vernacular language research production. But on the other hand, when you make that decision to produce a piece of scholarship or even translation work in Spanish, you also then know you're limiting the potential pool of readership and of colleagues internationally who might then be able to engage with and read your work. You've published numerous books and chapters. I'm thinking of your work you've done on the Yoga Bija, this important early Sanskrit text associated with these Nāth yogis, translated into Spanish. So how do you navigate that today as a scholar working in Mexico? Now, boundaries and the way that information and knowledge is spreading online is so different today even than in years past. How do you kind of make those decisions about whether to publish in Spanish or English or both?
Yeah, it's been a constant negotiation. I'm not sure that it's going to end because this is a reality. There are these two worlds, so to speak, or publishing worlds, and completely different. Well, not completely different, but fairly different audiences. And well, this is also part of why I decided to do research on yoga in Latin America, because evidently modern yoga studies is eminently Anglophone. And there is, not just in this field of modern yoga studies or South Asian studies, but in many other fields, a very fixed, anglicized sort of lenses, an epistemological, say, bias. And I'm not saying this in a resentful way.
No, but even the categories that scholars use to talk about religion and spirituality.
Right, and this is actually what I find is problematic. Not just problematic, it is also, or can be, a weakness, because when a group of people only think through English by necessity, or even if you think in English, working with South Asian sources and languages, mainly you're thinking through English, you can easily fail to notice that that the world is much broader, and that the world can be read, probed, and analyzed through different epistemological and linguistic tools. And every language, which is in itself a whole culture, can contribute different sort of eye-opening keys, issues, problems, etc. It can also, by reflection, let you see in more depth something that you are discussing. But then, of course, at some point I decided, well, maybe I should just start publishing in English, basically. And it just eventually keep my public talks in Spanish. But I felt that I do have an obligation to my Spanish speakers, the Spanish-speaking countries and potential readership, because at least for two different reasons, at least. One of them is that I've always been into public schools, except for my elementary period. That was a private school. But apart from that, I've done everything in public schools. That means that basically I have been gifted with, by being financed by the state to being educated. So a way in which I can retribute this favor is by giving stuff that my people can read. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, the yogic community is increasingly eager to have material, serious material on yoga. And this is a drastic change. 10 years ago, when I began giving talks on yoga, which can be critical and demystifying, it was a bit problematic, and some people will react in hostile ways. It's changed dramatically. They are like much more open, and they are very appreciative of having material, not just talks, but publications in Spanish. It's also a way in which I can make them feel taken into account. Yoga is also them, because they do yoga. They are part of this world, and they're part of the culture of yoga at the global scale.
Yeah, so many of our students at Yogic Studies, as I've shared with you, are coming from various Latin American countries, from Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and we commonly are getting, I think anytime we advertise a course, we get the question, is this also available in Spanish? And
right.
And I wish we could. It's complicated with subtitles and translation, right, because of the technicality of the nature of our lectures and so forth. Maybe at some point we'll receive some grant at Yogic Studies to be able to translate our courses into other languages. If anybody's listening and wants to help finance such a project. But for your course, one thing that we are trying to do is include some of the readings in Spanish, some articles, some short chapters in Spanish. So if you are a Spanish reader, you'll be able to read some of the available literature that is in Spanish, perhaps in your native language. And then two, while we can't put the entire lectures or Q&A sessions in Spanish, because that would be double the work for our professor here, Adrián Muñoz, we are at least going to add on about 10-15 minutes at the end of each of the Q&A sessions on Zoom, where we'll have Spanish Q&A. So you'll be able to ask Adrián questions in Spanish, and he can, respond in Spanish. And, it's, at least in some small way, we can kind of lean towards, the non-Anglophonization of yoga and yoga discourse and yoga studies. Let's talk though now. Let's talk about this course. Let's talk about this new research that you're doing. As far as I'm concerned, really groundbreaking research on the history of yoga in Latin America. You've already written at least one, if not two, articles or chapters on this topic, but I know it's part of a larger book project that you're working on and that you'll be sharing with students in this upcoming course. Let's start with kind of where we are right now. What does yoga look like today in Latin America? What countries comprise this category of Latin America?
Oh, yes, those are, all of them are tricky questions, and they can have each an hour response. Let's begin with probably Latin America. I'm not going in too much detail here, but just to give a general understanding, especially for people who are not in Latin America. It is a huge region that comprises over 20 countries, more than 20 countries, from Mexico to Argentina. So that means that it's most of the American continent, from geographically the north, which is Mexico, up to the southernmost part which is Argentina. And then in between, you have, of course, Central America and different other countries in the Caribbean or islands, not all of them. No? The category is also problematic, as we will probably discuss in the course. There are other labels or categories that you can use. Each of them has a different problem. No? What I'm trying to bring with the category is Spanish-speaking countries and Brazil, which is Portuguese-speaking. So in principle, I'm not taking into account any Anglophone country for obvious reasons. I mean, most of them are being covered or should be covered by other scholars who are doing work on Anglophone yoga. I'm not also taking into account Francophone countries, which I'm not completely happy, but it's very difficult. I mean, it's a huge region.
It's a huge region with
a huge region. So
cultural complexities and histories, and even within that, you have to focus your attention somewhere.
Exactly, and precisely because this is a huge, very ambitious, gigantic enterprise that cannot be done by one single person, I decided to gather a group of colleagues in Latin America, who are based in Latin America mainly, so as to take part of the project. Of course, I can't do it all. I mean, even thinking just Mexico would be very difficult because there is virtually nothing. So that's how eventually I managed to convince Gabriel Martino and other colleagues. More recently, I've also invited, I should say, this group, this collective has a name, although we are an official research project because we are not financed by any institution or organism. I do have some funding by a Mexican organism. That's for my particular project on the history of yoga in Mexico, not for the whole project. But the whole project is called YOLA. A nice wordplay. So this is, of course, a project devoted to scrutinize the history, the reception, and the adaptations of yoga in Latin America. So Gabriel Martino is on board. I recently also invited Roberto Simoes, a Brazilian scholar, who has already published a couple of things on the early history of yoga in South America. So he's done interesting and valuable work. I have other colleagues, and also more recently, I think I have already convinced Boragin Larios to also participate. So if he's listening, he cannot step back.
Okay, you hear that,
Him,
no? Mutual friend of the podcast, Bordian.
Yes, he's a nice guy and also a very dear friend of mine. So for the course in yogic studies, the people should expect that, of course, there would be a more pronounced accent on modern forms in Mexico because of my background and the research that I've done. But I am perfectly willing to try, and I will bring in different issues in other parts of the region. I cannot cover every country. That's not possible. But I will try to address the major trends and episodes as far as possible, beginning by the 1900s, more or less, up to the present.
Let me return. Thank you for that. Tell us a little bit from your vantage point, from your research. What does yoga look like today in Latin America, broadly speaking, or we could even focus specifically on Mexico? How is it similar and or different to other modern flavors, other modern expressions of yoga in the US, in Europe, globally. What do you see going on kind of in this modern landscape of yoga in Latin America today? And then maybe we can start to go back a little bit,
Right.
peel back some layers of history.
As for the general modern landscape, you would find very similar expressions in Mexico, and I would say that in most parts of Latin America, that is an emphasis or a preponderance of body-oriented practices, postural yogas, different forms. They would be much more visible in advertising and everywhere, yoga studios everywhere, in every neighborhood, almost every neighborhood, for sure in every big city. No? And this is an interesting thing. I think that nowadays yoga is a key issue in gentrification processes. I don't think there is a place that's become gentrified that does not have a yoga studio or some form of space that allows the practice. I'm not saying this is the only thing, but it's one of the
along with the Starbucks,
one of the sine qua non, right?
Okay.
There is usually a vegetarian culture side by side. I can't say that every single practitioner is a vegetarian, but it is quite common. This is part of it. And consumption of tea, of course, like in many other places. And then this sort of, say, secular urban spirituality, something that can be problematized and discussed in greater detail in different spaces, not just in the course for yogic studies, but in other discussions in general. And so the images of slim people, fit people doing complex asanas is also very part of our, say, yogic imagery or iconography. This is more or less in consonance with the expressions around the globe, I think. But then there are also like regional innovations. This is something I still have to research in more profundity, because it's a complex but very fascinating issue. I think this is where you can find specific regional flavors, apart from some historical episodes, which are very interesting and intriguing, some of them. So, for example, one of the things that is more or less common is that you would find yoga retreats in beaches, and Latin American beaches are beautiful, and in also beautiful woods or near to some sort of like natural scenery.
Yeah, the yoga and tourism and kind of spiritual ecotourism, I think, is a huge topic and industry. I mean, I have to say, in my very cursory research on Google Images, typing in yoga in Latin America, and just looking around for some images, perhaps just to associate with this upcoming course, consistently what comes up online is what appears to be actually American or European white women doing yoga in, say, Tulum, Mexico, or Machu Picchu in Peru.
Yeah.
An advertisement for a yoga retreat in Latin America for foreigners. Rarely could I actually find images of Mexicans or Chileans or Brazilians, what have you, doing yoga in just a shala or a studio. I'm sure there's plenty of images out there, but
Yeah,
That's the top hits that are coming up on a Google search when one looks at the surface level of these things. And so I do think there is something telling about that, that's
absolutely.
dominating the public imagery of what's going on today.
Absolutely. I mean, if you come across these images at the top of the search, it speaks of something that is being offered, but it also speaks about the great demand for this. They wouldn't be there if there weren't people like looking for this. Yes, it happened to me as well. No? Hundreds of pages and advertisements for yoga retreats, and most of these sites were in English.
Right.
Sometimes you could turn or switch into Spanish language, but most of them were Anglophone oriented. This is a topic which I think needs to be researched. I don't know if I'm going to do this. I'm hoping that other colleagues in the region would listen to the call and get on board. But what my guess is that, of course, there is a sort of spiritualization of topographic scenery of Latin America, which in any case were already exoticized previously by foreigners, tourists, and occultists alike. So it's nothing new. It's like part of a trend.
Yeah.
It's just becoming more complex, merged with all other things. No, of course, economics, but not just that. No, there are a whole range of interests, drives. I don't know if explanations. That's a little bit more difficult to find, but I think this is worth studying.
So take us back a little bit to the internal history and reception of yoga in some of these Latin American countries. As you've been doing this research, what have you learned? When I think about which is more familiar to me, the history of yoga in the United States. And there's been a great deal of scholarship one can read about this history, and it's kind of, there's some very key figures, poignant moments, in the development of the ideas and practices of yoga in the United States. One often will point to Emerson and Thoreau in the 1800s as kind of being exposed to the Bhagavad Gita and Vedanta. And Thoreau is sometimes identified by scholars as the first American yogi.
Yeah.
In this letter to a friend, right? I think he, for the first time in the English language, perhaps he self-identifies as a yogi living out in his little cabin in Walden Pond.
Yeah.
And then you have Vivekananda coming to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. This really important moment for the reception of Indian religions and yoga and Vedanta. And Paramahansa Yogananda, and we have these different waves of Indian gurus coming to the United States, to Europe. All that history has all been complicated and nuanced, and there's
right
bulk shelves of literature now we can read about that. There's less existing scholarship on the Latin American side, which makes this all the more exciting. But so tell us just a little bit. Obviously, we don't have time to tell this entire story, but is there a key figure or two that jumps out at you as, who perhaps you identify even as, say, the first Mexican yogi or the first Latin American who's inspired by India or yogic thought?
Yeah, there are quite a number of figures. I haven't studied all of them in detail, of course. You need a lot of time, but the idea is to do so. Now, I remember that I was reading this book by Hugh Urban, Magia Sexualis. You've read that?
I haven't read it, but I know the one.
It's a quite amusing and interesting book. It has different chapters devoted to key figures who have been very influential for Western esotericism and commingling of magic and sexuality, usually by invoking tantric imagery or sexual yoga or some sort of things. So on the chapter devoted to infamous magician Aleister Crowley, I read that he paid a visit to Mexico in 1900, and that it was there when he began practicing yoga. Of course, I was completely blown away. How come? No, of course, my first idea was that probably yoga entered Mexico around the 60s as a secondary outcome of the hippie counterculture. This was much earlier. So, of course, I was intrigued. I tried to learn what happened unsuccessfully. I haven't found much on it. As it turns, apparently, he learned yoga from his fellow mountaineer. Crowley came to Mexico to climb some peaks. He was also a mountaineer. And this other guy, Oscar Eckenstein, was already a yoga practitioner. So that's how he became.
He was a European or American who also...
European. I forgot what's his nationality.
Okay. So they happened to bring their knowledge of yoga with them, and then he got exposed to hiking in the mountains.
Now, of course, I had to find whether they for surely had social interaction with locals. Somebody has been there, probably a Freemason, because obviously Crowley didn't just spend his time climbing. He obviously had some sort of rituals all the time. I mean, it was Aleister Crowley. How come he was not getting in touch with the other occultists and magicians and Freemasons? He was for sure, but it's an information not easy to find. So, I kept on reading, and eventually I found that this other key major political figure in Mexican history was a reader of the Bhagavad Gita. So in a sense, so far as I can tell, he's the very first Mexican yogi. Of course, we have to understand yoga in its broader sense. No?
Who was this?
He was Francisco Madero. He was a Mexican president.
The president of Mexico was.
He was a president, Gita. And he was linked. He was actually one of the major agents in bringing about the Mexican Revolution. So that's how important he was to Mexican history and politics. So Mexican Revolution more or less lasted from 1910 to 1920, approximately.
Did I read, I think it was in your article, or maybe I looked him up after your article, but did he write his own commentary on the Gita in Spanish?
He did. That's crazy, of course.
That's pretty wild. I can't imagine any of our contemporary presidents doing such a thing.
Yeah, it's completely crazy, of course. And now the thing is, and this is similar to what happened in other parts of the globe, Indian ideas had a very particular channel. And this channel, which is very diffuse and heterogeneous, has to do with esotericism and occultism and different sort of similar associations. And in this case, he read the Bhagavad Gita through theosophical translations into Spanish, done by Spanish theosophists in Barcelona specifically. There were 2 or 3 translations into Spanish of the Bhagavad Gita. He didn't read English, as a matter of fact. That's also interesting. Madero was not Anglophone. He was Francophone. So that's a different, link in this chain of transmission and reception. French culture was very important at the time in Mexico. It was part of the Mexican intelligentsia. They would first learn French as a foreign language and done only eventually English. Of course, that changed after the Mexican Revolution, but at least partially. So this is crazy because his reading of the Gita actually was important for his political career. It wasn't a hobby. It was serious matter.
Yeah.
He read it pretty much like Andy. Of course, they each had different readings, but they both read it because of a political mission.
Yeah.
And both of them thought or conceived themselves as though they have a divine sort of mission for the political life of each other's countries.
And we know, I mean, the Gita, it makes sense with the Gita in many ways. Is this Kshatriya text to serve counsel, political, like how does one act? How does one serve? How does one engage in the world, right? But how fascinating. So around what years was that happening?
He wrote his comments on the Gita around 1911 and 1913. He got killed while being a president. He was in office. And
is his commentary on the Gita, is that something that is published or is widely available?
It is available now. It wasn't at the time. And I mean, because it was completely crazy. How this is a president writing his own commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. So he published them under a pseudonym.
Oh, okay.
Not under his name. There was a lot of exactly. Only that in this case, his commentaries went by the name of an adept.
Oh, interesting.
He was a spiritualist.
A siddha.
As a matter of a spiritist.
No, but an adept. I think of
Yes, exactly. Yes, right.
Siddha is sometimes translated in English for better or worse.
Yeah, exactly. Madero had no knowledge of Sanskrit, of course.
Sure.
I don't think that nobody in Mexico had any knowledge. I think that probably in Argentina they were earlier in coming to get knowledge or direct knowledge of the Sanskrit language, but not in Mexico at that time. So what he read was through theosophist translations. Even though he was no theosophist, he was against theosophy, as a matter of fact, because in general, spiritualism rejects theosophy and vice versa. But the only available material in Spanish at the time were the publications of the Theosophical Society. And they were tremendous. I mean, their network is not just confined to the Anglophone world.
Yeah.
It has a multilingual reach.
And did the archivists, did they have centers set up in Latin American countries?
Yes, I think actually the very first one was in Buenos Aires, if I'm not mistaken. And then eventually in other parts, Mexico for sure, Central America, but I'm not sure which country. And I think they still do have some centers around. I mean, they're not much known, not like hathayoga for sure, or the Hare Krishnas, that they're much more evident. No?
So perhaps similar then to the United States, kind of the first encounter with Indian religion, the ideas of yoga is a spiritual, intellectual one through texts.
Yeah,
through a text like the Gita. When did let's say Indian gurus start coming to Latin America?
Well, the very first two people that I know that come to, I'm speaking of Mexico. I cannot speak of all of the countries, but in Mexico, there were Paramahansa Yogananda in 1929.
Yeah.
So it was more or less early. He was already in California, of course.
Right.
And this is a topic I'm doing research in, preparing a paper. So this was his only visit, I think, to Mexico. And of course, this led to the eventual establishment of yoga centers in Mexico. But I'm not sure that his trip was intended for proselytizing or something. It was apparently more a vacation. He was just on holiday. Mm-hmm. I know that he gave a couple of lectures or talks, but I haven't been able to trace the content of them. Even though I have some pictures, I have no content of his speeches. Now, at the same time, there was another figure, Charles Gina Rayada. He was one of the key members of the Theosophical Society. He was formerly from Sri Lanka, and at the same time, they came at the same time to Mexico City. The newspapers talk of both of them. And in the case of Gina Rayada, he is doing. This is a tour specifically for spreading the teachings and ideas of the Theosophical Society.
Yeah.
And then I don't know. I'm not really sure. Somebody must have come, but I'm not really sure if somebody did before. There must have been before the opening of the Hare Krishna and the Sita centers.
Yeah, which would have been in the late 60s or early 70s, perhaps, post countercultural. Yeah. And that's probably, is that when maybe when does then postural yoga start to take off? I know BKS Iyengar and Patabi Joyce made visits to
Indra Devi was
Devi, yes,
she was in
Krishnamacharya.
Yes, she was in Mexico, Uruguay, and Argentina in particular. No, but she went to Panama as well. Her story is fascinating, very complex. Yeah. So during all of her avatars throughout her life, from everything from a dancer to an actress to everything. She eventually went to the US and she became like this celebrity.
Yeah.
But while there, she also gave some yoga sessions in northern Mexico. I don't remember if this was near Tijuana. But then after a couple of months, probably she went back to India, I think, and then she came back to the American continent. But I think she went directly to Buenos Aires. This anecdote I completely forgot. But this was late 70s or early 80s, no?
Yeah, I believe she spent kind of the remainder of her life teaching in Argentina, right?
Yeah. But of course, she wasn't the only person who brought postural yoga to the region. There were other people before her.
But she was a yoga influencer of the day.
Yeah, completely. And she was a celebrity. It's a very powerful image, very charismatic as well. But for example, in the 1940s, in 1947, 48, so, India is just becoming independent, and not an Indian, but a French guy. He was an occultist and philosopher and a self-styled guru. He had this vision of founding a new religious group, an esoteric one that had to do with the age of Aquarius. And he founded this brotherhood in Caracas, Venezuela. And from there, the brotherhood spread all throughout Central America and to other countries in Latin America. And this brotherhood became very, very influential. They were probably among the very first ones who gave possibility of doing postural yoga with asanas and some sort of pranayama. This is an interesting chapter as well. I'm just beginning to dive into it. It's a very complex one as well, no? But it's quite interesting. This was a French guy. No? This is also interesting. It was not an Anglophone person or Indian guru, because most of the Indian gurus who've been to Mexico or Latin America basically do it through the help of English, and then having an interpreter. I'm not sure if there has been an Indian guru who eventually learned Spanish or Portuguese. I'm not quite sure. No? But then things in Brazil have been completely different. Right. Like different trajectories. No? That's also fascinating. Sometimes with a relationship to Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, but in itself, it's a completely different world. No?
So tell us a little bit more about the upcoming online course, YS 118 Yoga in Latin America. What can students expect? We've got 4 modules. It's a 4-week course. Do you want to give us just a short little preview of what that will entail?
Right. So all of these anxieties and questions that we have been dialoguing are going to be discussed and delved into in the course in the 4 modules. So I'm trying to bring this into a more or less chronological view or overview. So in the first module, I would like to discuss the field of modern yoga studies and the impact of what we can call Anglophone yoga. Well, other scholars have already called it that. So this would force us to reflect on ideas of Orientalism, colonialism, and modernity in a general way. And then by this, to rethink Latin America within global history. And then this will help us understand how these New Age and esoteric networks have been very much part of modernity all around the globe, including Latin America. I mean, I've already mentioned the Theosophical Society and spiritualism. This is they were international networks and, say, global discourses around the globe that were shared by different people. And then in the second module, I would like to discuss specifically the first decades of the 19th century, in which different ideas and notions of yoga became part of political discourse or events, like the episode of Francisco Madero, which I already mentioned. But sometimes also these ideas of yoga in Mexico, in other parts of Latin America, were also part of national projects of, say, modernization and progress and enhancement of the national psyche of different countries. They were related to the betterment of the individual and therefore a betterment of the social body. That's interesting to read how yoga was also part of this in different Latin American destinations. And then in the third module, we will be much more interested in dealing with beatnik impact on the hippie culture or counterculture at the global scale, and then how in particular this translated into Latin American episodes. So psychedelia, the blooming of New Age, and alternative therapies they were embraced by different peoples in all of these regions, opening different sorts of centers and retreats. And in part, this is the beginning of ecotourism would be much more important and strong in the later decades, and which are to be discussed as well in the fourth and last module. In that last one, we will discuss in more greater detail aspects of physical yoga, not only physical yoga, but especially since the 1980s around. And especially, I would like to say, critically think of how the global and the local are in constant conversation, even though sometimes one tries to negate the other, they actually negotiating constantly. And this is part of the reason why tourism is tremendously important in the culture of yoga. And this is true of Latin American forms of yoga, definitely. There is an appeal to an international audience, but at the same time, there is an attempt to stress the regional, say, values or importance or agencies, no, so to speak. In this last module, we will speak of Indra Devi's career in Latin America and other regional innovations, sometimes syncretic forms, which have to do with indigenous religious practices. And that's why you would have images of a yogi practicing or yogini in Machu Picchu, for example. No, it's got to do with this aspect. And it's a lot of things that are to be covered in the 4 modules, but I hope we don't go crazy and but I hope that we can enjoy it. No, I'm looking forward to it, and especially to the Q&A sessions. I'm really looking forward to what the audience thinks of it. How do they react, especially if there are people from Latin America? So their own feedback would be very valuable to me. No, I mean, that is not to neglect the other students, of course, but you get my point.
Absolutely. No, it's going to be a fascinating course, an important one, and I think a unique one. Again, this is new research, and it's ongoing. And I think the exciting thing is that the conversations with the students can also help to reframe, to bring new insights, new questions, perhaps even new ethnographic data of the yogis and yogis
Yes.
in Latin America.
Absolutely.
So I'm really excited. The course runs live from October 4th through 29th, 2021. But if you're tuning into this after those dates, the recordings will be available for self-study, so you can enjoy this course anytime thereafter. Adrián, I think I've kept you here for long enough. I think we've gone way over time, actually. Thanks so much to our listeners for staying on with us after hours here, and actually to our viewers as well. I forgot to mention this is the first time ever we're having video on, and this Yogic Studies podcast is airing on our YouTube channel. So if you're a regular listener of the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you consume the audio version of the podcast, go check out the video form on the Yogic Studies YouTube channel. So thanks again, Adrián. It's been wonderful to hear your story, to learn more about your research, past and present. Anything else that you'd like to end with today, or maybe that we didn't get to touch on?
There's probably 100 of things that I didn't speak of or left in the air, but what to do? You can do everything. No, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. Well, looking forward for the course, and I hope that this new format of the podcast, becomes really something. I think actually what you're doing is really something, not just the podcast, but the whole project of yogic studies. So I'm happy to be part of it. Thank you, Seth.
Well, thanks, Adrian. It wouldn't exist without good folks like yourself. So the success of yogic studies, I think, is a tribute to the wonderful scholars and colleagues and people doing this work that we're able to bring on and highlight. But then, of course, because of this amazing community of students and people who are interested in these studies, and we're able to create this platform to try to make it a little bit more accessible and available to those who really want to learn and soak up this knowledge. So, yeah, thanks for playing your part and getting to tell kind of a new chapter, a new piece in yoga's fascinating and, like unending story of yoga. Just when you think you kind of know what yoga is and the history of yoga, and then we open up just all these untold stories and chapters of yoga's incarnations, the avatars of yoga in Latin America.
Absolutely.
All right, Adrian. Well, please take care. We'll be in touch here soon about the course, and everybody else. Until next time.